former candidate for the U.S. Senate, longtime radio talk show host, author, and conservative policy advocate.
Justices to the Supreme Court, the left has been in open panic.
Liberty Nation with Tim Donner.
Democrats full of sound and fury, so far signifying nothing. Welcome back into Liberty Nation Radio, a production of LibertyNation.com and heard from coast to coast on the Radio America Network. Democratic presidential hopefuls take the stage for the sixth time, with the new frontrunner taking incoming and the former frontrunner stumbling his way through explanations of his alleged corruption. This against the backdrop of a Democratic Party hopped up on impeachment like steroids, but with a leader still unwilling to call a vote. Plus, Hunter Biden says he did nothing wrong, but promises to never do it again. LeBron James steps in it as the NBA tries to spin its betrayal of Hong Kong freedom fighters and embrace of communist China. And LibertyNation.com legal affairs editor Scott Cosenza joins us for Talkin' Liberty. With impeachment on the mind of all good Democrats, none of whom have cast a vote for it yet, the Democrats got together for their sixth presidential debate in the key battleground state of Ohio, won handily by Trump in 2016. And for all the predictable talk of Trump as a criminal and their usual dark vision of Trump's America, which can only be healed through social justice warfare, tamped down a bit by everyone but the two progressive frontrunners as the election gets closer. But it was also really strange in another way. Watching the Democrats' latest combustible mixture of Trump derangement and socialist pandering was at one stage like entering a time warp. And let me tell you what I mean, because it was easy to miss this amidst all the hate and collectivism and victimhood being spewed on that stage in Ohio on Tuesday night. Once the subject turned to foreign wars, suddenly up was down and down was up. The scene was akin to what it must have been like when the Southern segregationist Democrats, you know, the ones, some of them who were friends with Joe Biden, were suddenly instructed in the 1960s to become pro-civil rights. I don't think they knew what to do. For this entire century and longer, and despite a disaster in Vietnam commenced by Democrats, it was Republicans who were tarred as the party of war, which was an image burnished during the era of George W. Bush, to be sure. Democrats, on the other hand, were doves, furiously opposed to the Iraq War and subsequent foreign adventures. But now, because Donald Trump made an executive decision to protect the lives of a few dozen troops in the direct line of fire from an invading army of Turks, the Democrats are all in on keeping young Americans stationed in a place and for a cause of no consequence to the folks back home. They don't care about the Kurds. They care about their troops. Joe Biden shrieked, "Shameful, shameful," about Trump's troop withdrawal, saying it was just the most terrible thing he's ever seen. This was after he abruptly brushed off a direct question about Ukraine and his son's statement that he did nothing wrong in accepting millions in foreign payments following his father's state visits, but promised never to do it again. Let's give that a listen.
If it's not okay for a president's family to be involved in foreign businesses, why was it okay for your son when you were vice president? Vice President Biden?
Look, my son did nothing wrong. I did nothing wrong.
Your son, Hunter, today gave an interview, admitted that he made a mistake and showed poor judgment by serving on that board in Ukraine. Did you make a mistake by letting him? You were the point person on Ukraine at the time, if you can answer.
Look, my son's statement speaks for itself. My son made a judgment. I'm proud of the judgment he made. I'm proud of what he had to say. And let's focus on this. The fact of the matter is that this is about Trump's corruption. One of the reasons I am running is because of my age and my experience. With it comes wisdom.
Okay, that last part about wisdom came later in the debate. But exactly what kind of wisdom was it to allow your son to nakedly profit to the tune of millions of dollars, maybe billions, who knows, from deals consummated right after he traveled with his father, the vice president, on state visits to those very countries? And now Hunter's been exposed by Trump and been forced to resign from the board of a Chinese company that lined his pockets. More on that later during Say What. Oh, and one more thing on Biden. He also favored lifting the ban on suing gun manufacturers, the surest way to put them out of business and dry up the source for guns. So he's fully on board with gun control. And when Biden was finished decrying Trump and pledging his allegiance to aggressive gun control measures, we witnessed the expected monkey see, monkey do act among the remainder of the record debate field of a dozen candidates. All of them condemned the president for abandoning the Kurds, for whom they have developed a sudden attachment. But far more disturbing was the harsh treatment of Tulsi Gabbard for daring to say we should not continue our involvement in Syria, where there's been a civil war going on for years. This was the very thing that Trump promised in his election campaign. Tulsi Gabbard has struggled to gain any kind of traction by refusing to toe the line on the Democrats' newfound alliance with neoconservative war hawks intent on taking down Trump by any means which avail themselves. She took fire, did Tulsi, from all the candidates who were given time to go ahead and fire. It was groupthink in action. Now, for all the endless talk by presidents of limiting foreign involvements, this is what ending endless wars looks like, folks. Hard choices, prices to be paid for every decision which challenges conventional wisdom and conventional policy. Did we think it would be easy to reverse the course of a uniparty globalist foreign policy protected by an establishment hell-bent on protecting its turf from the invading Trump? Did we expect that the neoconservatives who cost the nation so dearly would simply accede to the demands of this outsider who came marching into Washington promising to shake the political establishment to its core? On the other hand, did we expect that Trump derangement syndrome would be so severe and so widespread that Democrats would resort to positioning themselves as the party of war? Think about that. Democrats positioned as war hawks in a war-weary nation. This is the remarkable spell Donald Trump has cast upon his enemies. And we'll return with Brent Bozell and the existential threat presented by growing social media censorship of conservatives.
Liberty Nation with Tim Donner.
We hear an awful lot today about bias in the establishment media, how every major legacy media outlet leans left, and now, more than ever, they are willingly shedding their veil of objectivity with the reviled Donald Trump in the White House. But the scale of that threat is nothing compared to the growing censorship of conservatives in social media. And the man ideally positioned to sound the alarm, the red alert on censorship, and the grave dangers it presents for the Republic is the founder and president of the nation's undisputed preeminent media watchdog organization, Media Research Center, who is now rightly turning his attention to social media, L. Brent Bozell III. Hello, my friend. Welcome back.
Hi. I'm expecting a bell to start clanging while I throw my arms up and we start with round number one.
Have you now, or have you ever been a member of an organization attempting to serve as a watchdog on media censorship? But You know, when we spoke about this censorship issue, Brent, in depth recently, you used some comparative numbers. CNN primetime viewers as opposed to Facebook membership worldwide to make your point that the social media censorship threat is far more existential than media bias. Give us those numbers.
Well, think about this for a second. Let's look at CNN and their primetime audience. Now, I will say with well, let me first give you the number. It's approximately 573,000 in a nation of 330 million. If you're doing the math, that's 0.2% of the American population. We like to point out that there are more people who own pet chickens than watch CNN.
Yes.
And there are more practicing prostitutes in America than there are viewers of CNN. There are more witches in America than there are viewers of CNN. Okay, what about Facebook?
I like it.
Facebook, 2.7 billion people around the world. Now, as a news source, which one's bigger? Guess what? And here's a survey that we saw recently, which is just stunning. 68% of the American people, think about all the news outlets there are out there. Tim, 68% of the American people say they get their news from Facebook.
Is there any sign that maybe the privacy issues on top of the issue of censorship are driving some people away from Facebook, or is there no evidence of that kind of thing happening?
You know, there are three issues at play here, three major issues. I think the first one is privacy, where the public is rarely concerned not just about Facebook, but about all of these companies and what access they have to every bit of information in your life. And every day you seem to learn that whether it was Facebook or Google or one of them, that there was a little trick they were playing with whatever it was, the app you got, the program they put on your computer, whatever it might be. So privacy is the first problem. The second problem is the problem that the far left finds, which is wealth. They believe these companies are too wealthy. And that's where the socialists like Elizabeth Warren are coming from. And the third one is where conservatives are falling, which is that they're too powerful. And that's where people like Senator Hawley and Senator Cruz are coming from. So there are three major problems. But here's the response that Facebook has to all of them. We'll just buy you. Facebook, like these other giants, is so wealthy and so powerful that I would defy anyone to try to compete against them. So you know, if you are, and all sorts of companies are now getting into this space, into this news information, communication space, and they're all tilting to the left.
So companies like Facebook and Twitter are absolute behemoths, monstrously large, untouchable as it now stands. So how can they be forced to change as private corporations? What's the solution? Some are saying antitrust action, painting these tech behemoths as monopolies. What say you?
Well, you know, let's first determine, is it absolute, what I just said, is it an absolute fact that you cannot, because only when it is an absolute fact can you proceed with things like antitrust. There are some people who will say, now, wait a minute. You said, you know, everybody said that it was an absolute fact that you couldn't compete against IBM. And then came little itty Microsoft, and look what they did. And then you said they were so big, there's no one that could compete against Microsoft. And along came little itty bitty Apple, and look what they did. So that just because you have these giants doesn't mean you can't compete against them. Secondly, there are those who will maintain, and these are men who are very wise men who know the inside of the industry inside and out. They will say that within 6 years that technology will exist that will be able to defeat these people. The question is, will they destroy America before that 6 years is up? I mean, that's how fast everything is moving on there. So at the end of the day, Tim, I would say that one has to look at this very, very carefully. If there is a glimmer of free market hope, you have to go for that. You only go, as a conservative, you only go for antitrust when that company has a monopoly, because for those people who say that antitrust discussion is antithetical to conservative thought, I'd argue it's the exact opposite. If you're looking at a monopoly, that is antithetical to free enterprise, and you have, as a conservative, you have a responsibility to break it up.
And that's a subject I want to pursue with you further. But in the meantime, I want to sort of review the bidding here in terms of what kind of things are done, because we use the word censorship, and that's a very serious accusation. But we've heard about shadow banning and deplatforming and demonetizing. What are the most common techniques used for holding the line against conservative speech?
You know, the biggest problem is you and I have had these discussions about where the so-called mainstream, I don't like that term, the old media are concerned.
Neither do I.
You have two kinds of biases. You have the bias by commission and the bias by omission. You can see the bias by commission. You can see the action that's been taken by a journalist to change the story. The bias by omission, by definition, is something you can't see. Therefore, it's the tree in the forest. If you didn't see it fall, did it fall?
That is Brent Bozell, and he had a lot more to say about the clear and present danger of social media censorship of conservatives and what can possibly be done about it. And we'll play you part 2 of our conversation with the nation's preeminent media watchdog on next week's show. But up next, Say What, including Hunter Biden's mea culpa, LeBron and the NBA dust-up with China, and a lonely voice of sanity on Syria.
Where can you find honest political commentary? With sobering analysis.
Even the most trusting among us may find a company's latest plans deeply intrusive.
Accountability.
Perhaps it's time to start asking the right questions.
Deconstructing threats to our liberty.
Unparalleled insight into important stuff.
And boldly reporting the truth.
Truth is making a comeback.
Well, hello again, and welcome to Election 2020 Roundtable.
Uprising podcast of LibertyNation.com.
Abortion is functionally sexist.
From my cold, dead hand.
Subscribe to the LibertyNation.com YouTube channel, where facts matter.
Click on youtube.com/LibertyNation.
Say what? Say what? Say what? One more time.
And now it is time for our signature segment, Say What, where we roll out an assembly line of wacky, astonishing, damnable, and ultimately revealing things uttered by politicians and the chattering class. Elizabeth Warren has been the recipient of a trio of valuable political gifts in recent days, and it's vaunted her to front-runner status in the Democratic presidential race. First, the Joe Biden Ukraine scandal was finally unmasked, with Biden's son now under fire and forced to resign from the board of a foreign company who filled his coffers mightily. Second, Warren's chief rival at the top of the progressive totem pole, 78-year-old Bernie Sanders, had a heart attack. And then third, before the debate took place this week, Bernie went on CBS and delivered what could be a gift to Warren as she strives not to frighten people with her socialist ideas.
Elizabeth Warren has been a friend of mine for some 25 years, and I think she is a very, very good senator. But there are differences between Elizabeth and myself. Elizabeth, I think, as you know, has said that she is a capitalist through her bones. I'm not.
No, certainly not. But Warren still took on a lot of incoming for her socialist views from some of the bottom feeders on the stage in Ohio Tuesday night. But then there's the guy who can run but cannot hide from, at minimum, the appearance of flagrant corruption, with his son closing massive deals with companies in foreign countries visited by him as vice president. And this week, in a surprisingly penetrating interview on ABC, Hunter Biden faced pretty much all the questions everyone's been asking.
Did you and your father ever discuss Ukraine?
No, there's no but to this. No. Nobody buys this idea that I was unqualified to be on the board.
What were your qualifications to be on the board of Burisma?
Well, I was vice chairman of the board of Amtrak for 5 years. I was the chairman of the board of the UN World Food Program. I was a lawyer for Boies Schiller Flexner, one of the most prestigious law firms in the world.
You didn't have any extensive knowledge about natural gas or Ukraine itself, though?
No, but I think that I had as much knowledge as anybody else that was on the board.
If your last name wasn't Biden, do you think you would have been asked to be on the board of Burisma?
I don't know. Probably not. I don't think that there's a lot of things that would have happened in my life that if my last name wasn't Biden. Did I make a mistake? Well, maybe in the grand scheme of things, yeah. But did I make a mistake based upon some unethical lapse? Absolutely not.
That is the Biden story, and they're sticking with it. With the elder Biden saying in the debate he is proud of his son's judgment. Okay. But lost in the impeachment hysteria surrounding our nation's capital, though still no vote, no one on the record, and lost in the debate of this week was some of the things offered up by Democrats in last week's LGBTQQ town hall on CNN, culminating with a hysterical outburst from a black transgender.
Do you think religious institutions like colleges, churches, charities, should they lose their tax-exempt status if they oppose same-sex marriage?
Yes.
I currently identify as non-binary. In California, I am able to change my gender to X. However, on the federal level, there is no such option. Will you recognize third gender markers on a federal level?
Yes. I'm an extraordinary black trans woman, and I deserve to be here. My black trans sisters that are here, I am tired. I am so tired. I'm just sitting there, and it's not just my black trans women, it's my black trans brothers too. And I'm going to say what I'm going to say.
That on CNN, and without even a hint of embarrassment. Do you realize that a candidate for president, Beto O'Rourke, said there that he would eliminate the nonprofit status of churches and any organizations that don't support same-sex marriage? I guess he'll do that right after he, hell yeah, confiscates your AR-15s and AK-47s. Meanwhile, incredibly, almost no one in the political establishment or running for president, except maybe Tulsi Gabbard, seems willing to support President Trump's withdrawal of troops from Syria as the northern part of that country is overrun with Turkish attackers. Instead, calling Trump every name in the book for abandoning our Kurdish allies. A lone voice of dissent and perhaps reason is the non-interventionist Republican Senator Rand Paul appearing on Meet the Press.
Turkey was coming in one way or another, and 50 soldiers would simply be in the way and be a tripwire to a much worse outcome. And so I think the president was right in moving 50 soldiers out of the way of an onslaught. The president made a judgment that I think most military commanders would agree with, that you don't have 50 soldiers, that you don't go to war with 50 soldiers. Once the Turks said they were coming, it would have been foolish to leave 50 soldiers in the wake of tens of thousands of people coming across the border.
And exactly what about that doesn't make sense? And exactly how many Americans favor continuing another endless war in the Middle East? For what benefit? And speaking of benefits, weren't we? The NBA is in the midst of a firestorm over the benefits they get from their relationship with China and its over 1 billion consumers. Benefits great enough that they were willing to throw under the bus the Houston Rockets general manager Daryl Morey, who tweeted his support for the anti-communist freedom protesters in Hong Kong. And a bad situation got far worse when megastar LeBron James attacked Morey.
I don't want to get into a feud with Daryl Morey, but I believe he wasn't educated on the situation at hand, and he spoke. So many people could have been harmed, not only financially but physically, emotionally, spiritually. So just be careful what we tweet and we say and what we do. We do have freedom of speech, but there can be a lot of negative that comes with that too.
Did that sound like a warning? Like a shot across the bow? Don't mess with our client China. Toe the line. Ignore Hong Kong or else. You know, the NBA would have been far better off if it just admitted that China's a huge client who they don't want to get upset and be done with it. It would still be wrong, but at least it would be honest. A straight money deal. But through all of this, let's remember, and if we don't, the elite media will remind us with their widely distributed left-wing talking points, that the only thing that really matters these days, folks, is the actions of this despicable president leading to a constitutional crisis.
Underway right now, America in the middle of a constitutional crisis.
It's a constitutional crisis in the making.
Are we in a constitutional crisis?
We are in a constitutional crisis.
The U.S. is facing a constitutional crisis as the president goes to war with Democrats over his impeachment.
Remember that phrase, constitutional crisis? Well, it's swirling yet again.
We are nearing that kind of constitutional crisis at this point.
This is probably a constitutional crisis.
We are now in the midst of a partisan brawl. It could lead to a constitutional crisis.
Well, if David Gergen, who had a principal-ectomy, get it? Had all his principles removed? If David Gergen thinks it's a constitutional crisis, then by golly, we can rest safe in the knowledge that the rest of the swamp does too. And we'll return with Talkin' Liberty.
Liberty Nation with Tim Donner.
And now it is time to welcome in our regular contributor, constitutional lawyer, and LibertyNation.com legal affairs editor Scott Cosenza for the portion of the program which we call Talkin' Liberty. Hello, Scott.
Hello, Tim.
Okay, big news this week in terms of the D.C. sniper and the Supreme Court and whether life sentences for those who were minors when they offended are constitutional or not.
That's right, Tim. Lee Boyd Malvo was the young man who was part of the D.C. sniper team. They murdered 17 people all in. There were many states where they did commit their murders, but the majority were in Maryland and then Virginia. Well, you may recall, if you were around at the time and paid attention to the news, and I know that you did as a national capital area resident.
And people really were full of fear. People would pull into gas stations and they'd be afraid somebody was lurking.
They were effective terrorists.
They were,
to be sure.
They were.
Well, Mr. Malvo, you may recall, prosecutors in Virginia wanted to seek the death penalty for Mr. Malvo. His partner in crime, John Allen Muhammad, was executed by Virginia officials some years ago, and Mr. Malvo would probably have been executed as well, except for that he was under the age of 18 when he committed those crimes. He was a minor, and at the time the issue was still out there. It was not yet settled whether or not a minor could be legally put to death under the sort of newer rules with respect to capital punishment. The Supreme Court then, after the crimes were committed, came out with a ruling in that case, and they said it was not constitutional to give a minor capital punishment, or a person who was a minor when they committed those crimes. Then, Tim, another case came about which said from the Supreme Court, in a case where there was a mandatory life without parole sentence issued, the Supreme Court said you can do that a criminal justice system in the states, it's impermissible and violative of the defendant's constitutional rights if they're a minor to sentence them with life without parole if it's a mandatory sentence. Well, Malvo's sentence was not mandatory. In other words, He could have been sentenced to a range of sentences up to and including life, and that's what he got. So the question before the court, Tim, is that sentence also then unconstitutional?
And the answer,
well, we're just going to have to wait and see.
Is,
I can tell you.
What's your answer?
What's
your answer?
Well, I can tell you that in the several cases that have led up to this point, they have been 5-4 decisions.
Right.
And so the complexion of the court since those decisions were made has changed. And so I don't think it's just because those are the precedents that they're strong precedents. They're not long-standing precedents. They're sort of newer landmark decisions. And if a landmark decision is going to get overturned, oftentimes it will be in the first serious challenge to it with a complexion change in the court. So,
to what degree, though, in a situation like this where there's a highly emotional case that occurred that stoked fear in literally millions of people, that resulted in the deaths of 17 people in a slow trickle over a period of months, to what degree does the public emotion about, fry this guy, have any effect, do you think, on the ultimate judicial rulings on it?
I think none at all. These people are expert at divorcing themselves from these passionate issues. We're talking about life and death issues at the Supreme Court all the time. It's not like the case of a death penalty defendant who's saying they didn't do the crime. He has admitted to his crimes.
Now, let's bring it closer to home, because most people aren't going to commit murders in their lives, and certainly most people are not going to commit 17 murders. However, they will run up against speed cameras, and that's our next story, with an Ohio court allowing a referendum on speed cameras. This sure looks like good news to me.
Tim, I always like to focus on these stories because I feel like it's where the rubber meets the road for so many when it comes to liberty, and that is that if you live in a town and the city officials are getting their paychecks from the people's pockets, extracted through a red light camera company, how maddening and infuriating is it? And it's a low enough level of tyranny that few people do anything about it. It's hard to motivate state or federal authorities to do anything about it. And in this town, in Liverpool, East Liverpool, Ohio, they want to just go ahead and change the law themselves to make sure that those greedy politicians don't reach their hand into these people's pockets with one of these speed cameras. Well, the town, again, it's like they're being held hostage by the people who they pay to organize their affairs for their convenience.
Who they've elected or who they've elected and then has appointed these people, and then they're going after them.
In 2017, the city auditor, Ms. Marilyn Bosco, ruled that the referendum basically had an incorrect number of signatures or some kind of shenanigans to basically pull it from the ballot. And the question was whether or not it would be allowed to be voted on or not while that challenge went forward. The judge in this case, Columbia County Common Plea Judge Scott Washam, rules it will be voted on, and then they'll rule later on, and whether or not that issue about the signatures is valid enough or not. But I think it's a great step forward for this community's people to express to their leaders whether or not they want to be monitored and taxed in that way.
I have a feeling that I know the likely results of the referendum.
I wouldn't put my money on the speed cameras.
I wouldn't either. I think they start with a stacked deck against them.
Right.
Okay, so let's move now to the federal government, or more specifically to Article 2 of the federal government, which describes what the president can and cannot do. And President Trump has issued 2 new executive orders on agency guidance. It's a bit confusing. We're counting on you to untangle this.
This, Tim, I think is one of those issues where people would be shocked to understand how consequential it is. And this is one of those things about how much of a huge difference it can make who is president of the United States, in the sense of the difference between a Donald Trump presidency and a Hillary Clinton presidency, for instance, in this regard. The issue of executive agency lawmaking is one that animates limited government advocates like few others, because what happens often is Congress will pass a law mandating, let's say, for instance, some clean air standards or clean water standards, but they don't say that a company can emit a certain amount of pollutants or something like that. They leave it up to the federal agencies to institute that kind of rulemaking. The problem is that's not a federal law. It's a rule. Well, there are certain laws regarding how those rules are applied. And one of the ways that federal agencies work around the limitations on those rules, Tim, is they issue what's called a guidance letter. So if you're in a heavily regulated area and a rule's not on point or you're not clear how it should apply, you may ask for a guidance on this particular rule. But that's not a law. It's just some guy who works for the government who says, I think this is how it should go. Well, the problem is, and this is what the Trump administration's putting forth here, Tim, that guidance will still be able to be used as a shield, which is to say, if you ask for a guidance and they say, this is how we see this rule interpretation, and then later on they change their mind, but you have invested time and effort, you may be able to say, well, you told me you were going to do X, so I should be able to rely on that. But what we shouldn't have is these guidances used as a sword, which is to say, the law doesn't say that you can or can't do something, but these guidances are issued basically in order to compel your compliance with a regulator's wishes, not the law, because they have the mighty power of the federal government.
Well, I mean, we saw the power of the agencies with the power that was granted to the Secretary of Health and Human Services in Obamacare. They have extraordinary powers, people who are unelected, unaccountable, and distant from the people who elected the people that then appointed them.
Another example is all that Title IX stuff with the colleges. Those aren't new laws that have been passed. Those are just guidances that the Department of Education has passed down. So what the Trump administration has done, Tim, is basically say that those guidances are not to be enforced by these agencies like they are law. It's a massive level of protection, Tim, for Americans against the interference of the federal government.
Meanwhile, the federal judge has ruled that Obamacare protections violate religious freedom, a potentially significant ruling depending on the future of Obamacare.
Yes. And just to be clear, this is U.S. District Judge Reed O'Connor, and he stayed his own decision given the certainty of an appeal. So there's no new law today necessarily. Right. We're going to have to wait and see, but it could be the basis of that challenge. And it has to do with the requirement, basically, that healthcare providers perform abortions who don't want to, and that's what this protection was seen as covering. That a person cannot be compelled as a healthcare provider to give end-of-life care, something like that, whatever euphemism they use for it, against their wishes, as because it's a First Amendment protected activity to honor those one's own sincerely held beliefs in that regard.
Thank you, Scott.
Thanks, Tim.
This program, Liberty Nation Radio and LibertyNation.com's own podcasts, The Uprising, hosted by Scott with a smattering of me, plus The Rabbit Hole, Politics and Prose, where past is prologue. All of them available on demand at LibertyNation.com and from fine podcast providers everywhere. So that is it for this week, but we will be back at you next week. Same time, same station. Till then, this is Tim Donner saying, stand up for liberty. And we'll see you next time on Liberty Nation Radio.